Good evening, everybody. My name is Manuel Sirauki, Assistant Curator at DIA, and I want to welcome you all to DIA's Artes on Artes lecture series. Tonight we will have the pleasure to hear Pierre Leguillon address the work and, inevitably, the representations of the work of Carl Andre. As many of you know, DIA's acclaimed Carl Andre retrospective closed at DIA Beacon at the beginning of this month, on March 9, to start a 2-year-long international tour that will bring it to Madrid, Berlin, Paris, and Los Angeles. All throughout the 9 months, this retrospective was on view at DIA Beacon. We have presented multiple programs aiming to expand the scholarship on Andre's work from newer points of view, inviting both established and young art critics, museum curators, scholars, and artists to look at previously uncharted areas of Andre's nearly inexhaustible oeuvre. We couldn't imagine a more appropriate way to mark the closing of the exhibition and the beginning of its international tour than questioning the posterity and dissemination, the traces and influence of those historical works. We felt the need to ask ourselves, the way Pierre Leguillon does, whether those traces, images, ephemera, are the very matter of our historical memory and how they affect our experience of site-specific works, such as Andre's, when they are, I emphasize, presented in the present of an exhibition. It is a great honor to have Pierre Leguillon here tonight, an artist whose practice incorporates the roles of the curator, critic, photographer, projectionist, writer, collector, incidental barman, showcase designer, and art handler in equal amounts. I didn't say painter or sculptor, and in fact, I almost can't strictly say photographer, as Leguillon's photographs are defined by the condition of being often photographs of photographs, perhaps ad infinitum. And photographist would be maybe a better term. In this sphere of overlapping mediations and images of images, it is striking to think how influential the sculpture of Carl Andre, in its search for unmediated and uncompromising presence, may have been since the very beginning of Pierre Leguillon's career. Before I let him describe the complexities of that relationship, I will just give you a few facts about his work and trajectory. Born in Nogent-sur-Marne in France in 1969, Pierre Leguillon started publishing the one-page magazine Sommaire in 1991, where he invited collaborators such as Roman Signer and Ku Jong-a. Reviewing and documenting exhibitions for magazines such as Art Press in that decade, Leguillon also gave a number of art historical lectures where the verbal element progressively withdrew in order to give way to what Ian Wallace has called a literature of images. And the art of the slide projection as an essay form. This is how Leguillon developed the diaporama, the slideshow, an ongoing series of live presentations that he has performed in dozens of international venues to date, from the Musée du Louvre in Paris to Artist Space in New York City. In 2007, he created La Promesse de l'Écran, the promise of the screen, a hybrid of film club and speakeasy, composed of a 4x3 projection screen behind which is hidden a wine bar that works by interludes. In 2009, Leguillon presented Diane Arbus a printed retrospective, followed by the Arbus Bonus, a traveling exhibition device presenting a large collection of Arbus's magazine works in their original format, a work that is now part of the Carnegie Museum collection in Pittsburgh. Many other projects, such as Teatrino Palermo, Non-Happening After Ad Reinhardt, A Vivarium for George Orr, and Dubuffet Typographer, have been presented since then, and several mid-career surveys have taken place so far, at MAMCO in Geneva in 2010, and Wheels in Brussels in 2015. In many cases, these projects involve a large number of collaborations with other fellow artists, but also artisans. Leguillon's work investigates the limits of authorship and ownership, stripping the signatures bare, both in the common sense of personal marks and the philosophical sense of signatura, the language of things, and recalling the subtitle of his recent exhibition at Wheels, declassifying the hierarchies of the art object. Before we listen to Pierre, I'd like to thank those who have made this program possible, especially Dorothée Charles and the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in New York. This program is supported in part with public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. And we are also thankful to Brooklyn Brewery for the complimentary beverages tonight. I want to thank my colleagues at the Art Foundation, Kelly Kivland, Megan Whitko, Jennifer Borlansky, Blair Babcock, and Max Tanone for their help in synchronizing all elements of this program. As in previous occasions, there will be no Q&A at the end of the lecture, but Pierre will be happy to answer questions and listen to your comments over beer in a more casual manner afterwards. Lastly, a very special thanks goes to Pierre Leguillon himself for accepting our invitation and speaking at the Chelsea tonight. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Pierre Leguillon to DIA.
So thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you all for coming this evening, and many thanks to all my friends who were present in this audience. Your encouragement is very touching. Firstly, I would like to thank the DIA Art Foundation for their invitation and the DIA staff, especially Yasmine Raymond and Manuel Siraoki. I would also like to thank Dorothée Charles from the Cultural Services at the French Embassy and Dean Inkster for having translated my talk into English. I am not sure that you can imagine what it means for me to talk here tonight. As I prepared this talk, I had a hard time figuring out who were these words addressed to. Not only you, the audience tonight, but also my own past, my memory of this institution, and Carl-André himself. DIA represents a whole chapter in my experience as a spectator. Given that I have insisted on embodying through photography the eye of the captivated spectator, I now find myself speaking to you here tonight. The task is not an easy one. I have attempted to retrace my own past, but I have learned so much from DIA, and in particular from Carl-André's work, that it is almost impossible for me to present you with what is otherwise a kaleidoscopic vision covering a period of over 15 years. Firstly, I want to be clear that I will not talk about Carl-André as such, but rather about certain of his works, and in regard to those of other artists. Today, the art world deliberately perpetuates a certain confusion between artists and their work. Each time I have used the work of other artists, and they are numerous, most importantly Diane Arbus, Ad Reinhardt, Jean Dubuffet, George E. Orr, and tonight Carl-André, there have always been for me so many pretexts. Above all, pretext for an information. I see them through the prism of history. They contribute to my learning, or formation, as we say in French, in the educational sense of the term. And ultimately, they inform my practice in the sense that they give form to my own work. Thus, the procedures I undertake are both generational and generative. I think the various strategies of quotation and appropriation in art as much iconoclastic, in the sense that they seek to overturn idols, as they are signs of love, in the sense that it is impossible to develop an art practice in the absence of any form of filiation. I believe that the strategy of erasure in Robert Rauschenberg's Erase de Kooning's drawing from 1953 is a good example of this. One has to choose what one erases, and in this particular instance, Rauschenberg did so with the de Kooning's consent. After all, he was tackling on a cultural object and not de Kooning himself. I have often thought that the only way to move ahead was not to take the narratives found in the history books at face value, but on the contrary, to rethink history through hands-on experience in the field, even if my field, so to speak like a sociologist, and its medium are that one of the archive itself, that is to say, a medium comprised of second-hand material. At first, I sought to translate my personal experience as a visitor to exhibitions, and then I sought to translate my experience of art as it is mediated through the reproduction of artworks. I have always been concerned with art, and I have always expressed myself from an artistic perspective. Today, it cannot go unnoticed that war is continually waged in the name of images, and that art still has an obligation to question not only the nature, but also the economy of images in the broadest sense of the term. I wanted to begin by showing you this bag. This bag is the one that contains the sculpture Spiel, which Carl-André made in 1966 at the Douane Gallery in New York. For me, it symbolizes one of the primary lessons of Carl-André's work, the artist's autonomy. In fact, more than the image of a sculpture, chisel in hand, working under the natural light of a large studio, it brings to mind the baggage of a sales representative peddling samples from town to town. It conveys both a pragmatic and empirical approach to artistic practice. Above all, Carl-André has inspired in me a fundamental working method, and I hope that the personal cosmogony in which I place his work will resonate for you as it does for me. In an interview with Phyllis Tushman, published in Art Forum in June 1970, Carl-André declared, "The greatest and the best influences are, I think, the great negative influences, where a man blocks out a great body of work, and for those who come immediately after him, that road is closed to them. They have to find other roads, which is the best thing that could happen." Some years ago, I was invited to speak in Paris at the book launch for the French translation of Brian O'Doherty's Inside the White Cube. During my talk, I projected a series of slides of flying carpets after Carl-André, which I will project in a moment here. And Daniel Buren, who appeared to be quite perplexed, asked me rather abruptly, "Why Carl-André?" The public was surprised by his reaction, and one could immediately sense that this raised issues concerning a generation gap. And it is of different generations of images that I will now try to speak, beginning with the work of Carl-André. I am born in 1969, and I explained to Daniel Buren that I had not only grown up in the age of the white cube, but that I had also grown up in deep darkness, not in the darkened rooms or black boxes of video projections, but both in the darkened auditoriums where slides were projected during the art history classes I attended as an art student, and in the darkened halls of the Musée National des Arts et Traditions Populaires, the French Folk Art National Museum, where the exhibits appeared as if they were floating. The Musée des Arts et Traditions Populaires was founded by Georges-Henri Rivière in 1937 as the French section of the Musée de l'Homme, Museum of Man, at Trocadero in Paris. In 1972, it reopened in a tailor-made building in the Bois de Boulogne, a forest in the outskirts of Paris, where it was nicknamed the People's Louvre. It closed in 2005, and today the building, now boarded up, faces the new-built Louis Vuitton Foundation, designed by Frank Gehry. As an art student, I worked at the Musée des Arts et Traditions Populaires for a few months in 1991, an experience that came to have an indelible influence on me. Georges-Henri Rivière was one of the founders of the Musée de l'Homme and one of the most influential figures in the history of museography in Europe. In France, he is nicknamed the showcase magician. He exhibited all the objects in the Musée des Arts et Traditions Populaires in the dark, suspended from nylon threads, as in front of a black background in a photographer's studio. Rivière didn't consider it necessary to clutter the showcases in the ethnographic museum with mannequins, nor to place photographs next to the exhibits. He thought that if a handmade object was correctly lit and exhibited at the height at which it is normally held, visitors would be able to figure out how they were used. Dioramas, sometimes accompanied by sound recordings and triggered by the visitors, heightened the dramatic effect of the museum displays. Yet it was above all the absence of bodies, otherwise carrying or handling the object on display, which made the experience all the more captivating, each time returning visitors to their own bodily experience. I believe that my numerous visits to the Musée des Arts et Traditions Populaires helped me to develop an anthropological approach, which I not only later applied to my interest in exhibition display, but also to the ways in which I approach documents that, as objects, are likewise the offsprings of a cultural construct. For 15 years, I projected slideshows using a medium format slide projector like the one I'm using this evening. In 1998, I received a grant from the French Ministry of Culture to travel to the US with the intention of photographing works of art in the context in which they are exhibited in order to enlarge my slideshows. Until 1999, I accompanied the slideshows with music, after which I abandoned all forms of commentary following my stay in the US. Sequences of images already amounted to a form of phrase or sentence, and the music, often tacked on to the images, at times provide a form of commentary. As examples, I will now project two slide sequences. In general, I try to contrast images taken from exhibition catalogs with my own way of photographing artworks. I wasn't trying to construct a perfect image as such, but rather to measure the gap between different generations of reproductions. At first, I used part of my grant to go to Switzerland. Diabicon didn't exist at the time, and there were more paintings by Robert Ryman at the Hallen für Neue Kunst in Schaffhausen than anywhere in the US. It was obviously a challenge to photograph a Ryman painting. I had read an essay by Thierry de Duve explaining how Gerhard Richter and Robert Ryman had, each in their own way, made painting unphotographical. I took hundreds of photographs of Dan Graham's installation on the rooftop of Dia Chelsea, right there on the other side of the street. In this case, I merely reduplicated certain photos taken by Dan Graham himself or those taken by other visitors. Dan Graham's sculptures inspired a wealth of images before selfies became omnipresent in museums. I try to understand these spaces from the inside and to depict them as precisely as possible with a professional format camera. During my travels, I stopped in Minneapolis with the intention of traveling to Los Angeles, something I never did at the end. I spent several weeks in the library of the Walker Art Center, taking photos in books, magazines, and exhibition catalogs. Rosemary Furtak guided me at the Walker Art Center, an outstanding librarian whose name continues to resonate with those who have had the chance to meet her. Today, I try little by little to acquire certain books that she showed me at the time. She was the first to speak to me about Carl Andre and Hollis Frampton's 12 Dialogues. I thus discovered Hollis Frampton and his photographs of Carl Andre's sculptures, but also his photographs of Frank Stella's work, and a little later his conference on cinema and, I believe, eventually a book on Paul Scharitz. I could clearly see that what motivated Frampton's way of photographing was a genuine quote-unquote ideology. And that went against the grain of the type of photography that galleries or museums commission in their attempt to promote their own interests over and above those of the works themselves. I tried to photograph the same work several times, as reproduced in different contexts. It made me realize, for example, just how often artworks are reproduced the wrong way around. As I mentioned previously, I used various codes taken from ethnographic photography, for instance, rephotographing a photograph against an Hessian fabric background, which also intended to be neutral, has a material quality to it, which gives a sense of scale to reproduce objects. Frampton also used the same Hessian fabric background when he photographed Carl Andre's first sculptures. And in describing them to Andre in 12 Dialogues, he refers explicitly to the mugshot. My photographs of your work constitute a kind of mug book. They are after Bertillon, The subject is backed up in the hard light against a ruler and photograph front and right profile. But I could myself sometimes do the opposite. Each time I tried to highlight the inscription of the body within the image, the idolized body of the viewer in his or her engagement with the artwork. I then focused on two artists, two apparently very different sculptors, Karl André and Klaus Oldenburg. For both André and Oldenburg, the scale of sculpture is decisive. And I felt that in different ways they had, as male sculptors, contributed to deflating sculpture, or, if you will excuse the expression, débander in French, that they had both sought to undermine the erectile character of sculpture. Oldenburg made soft sculpture out of fabric, while André, as himself put it, placed Brancusi's endless column on the ground. Oldenburg began by doing performances, and he always emphasized the anthropomorphic or sexual character of the majority of objects he has represented. He has always been particularly attentive to the ways in which his sculptures are reproduced. I would also draw a parallel here with the photographs of Hugo Mulas in New York, the New Art Scene, which appeared in 1967, 8 years after Hollis Frampton's shots of Frank Stella. This book also had a huge influence on my own way of thinking about photography. So on the right, it's a photo of Hollis Frampton. For these two slides, which I discovered in the archives of the Walker Art Center, a blue background, probably chosen to highlight the yellow of the French fries, and a plinth were added to the sculpture. The fries are, of course, meant to be scattered on the floor, as the title suggests. The two images differ due to a slight variation in exposure. Karl André. I quote, "I have come to the conclusion that perhaps the only single thing that art has is scale, something which has nothing to do with size." Sorry. On the subject of the viewer's body and its relation to sculpture, I suggest reading Yasmil Raymond's excellent essay in the DIA catalogue, which lucidly demonstrates how André's sculptures choreograph the viewer's bodies, referring in particular to André's collaboration for a work by Yvonne Reiner. From there, we are only a step away from imagining André's floor pieces as dance floors. And didn't they also end up being used as a catwalk? This one is especially for Yasmil. It doesn't need a lot of imagination to see the relation between a sculpture by Karl André and Edward Muybridge and Etienne Jules Marais' chronophotography. Like the earlier work of Muybridge and Marais, André's sculptures measure both space and the duration of walking. The English artist and filmmaker Morgan Fisher explains in a text from 2005 how the set of relations between the modules in André's stacks repeats the set of relations between the modules in 16mm film. And speaking about film in the 12 dialogues, Hollis Frampton says, any one of the million of frames might be considered as a separate event. While scouring the library at the Walker Art Center, I came across a reproduction in a catalogue from the 1980s of one of André's famous floor pieces, floating in the middle of the page, or rather floating in outer space. In looking for a somewhat methodical way to contrast this image with other images, and namely with the famous photo of the Conrad Fischer Gallery opening in Düsseldorf in 1967 that you've just seen previously, I noticed that a lot of reproductions of this flying carpet kind has been published in important magazines such as Art Forum or in the catalogue of Documenta 4 during the very time the sculptures were being made. I began to identify with the statement made by the main character in Marguerite Duras' 1977 film Le Camion, que le monde aille à sa perte, c'est la seule politique. That the world goes to its ruin, it's the only politics. Thus, rather than attempt to produce one or two images of a different kind of Carl André's work, the circulation of which would in any case remain limited, I put together a small collection of the most beautiful examples of these flying carpets, and I decided to put them back in circulation. This series of flying carpets, as I thus named them, is the only series that I kept throughout my slideshows between 1999 and 2005. The carpets act as a recurring theme, or better still, a kind of running gag. And I believe that for viewers who have seen them take off several times, they embodied the site-specific character of each screening. In this sense, Carl André's sculpture, thusly reproduced, even if they are completely misrepresented, mark the specific qualities of both the screen and space, becoming a kind of test pattern for the projection screen. Adrena's nickname is painting from the 1950s is Persian Rugs. Carpets embody the ideal of flatness that high modernism strived for. Here, the modernist ideal encounters another ideal, that of a purportedly objective photograph. But these photographs, above all, mimic the photographs that one finds in trade catalogs and today all over the internet, where objects are cut out and stripped of their background. To cut out an object is to remove its shadow. The object is made unreal, since it no longer appears to be lit from an external light source. Its brilliance leads us to believe that it is capable of producing its own light. Most of consumer products are sold to us in this way. One of the main qualities of Carl André's flat sculptures, and undoubtedly what makes them so unique, is precisely that they don't cast any shadow. Thus, to cut out a sculpture by Carl André from its background makes no sense. I always ask myself what someone encountering Carl André's work for the first time might have understood from these reproductions. I also like to think that no one is responsible for them, or that they are part of a shared responsibility stemming from a genre photography that misrecognizes its object and produces an absence of meaning, As Carl-André himself declared in an interview with Achille Bonito Oliva in 1972, my love of gravity inherent in sculpture led me to practice this art. Now I would like to introduce a few more images about the German pedagogue from the 19th century, Friedrich Froebel. In 2003, I traveled in Thuringia in central Germany, where a small museum is devoted to his life and work. The inscription reads, "Facing this landscape, Friedrich Froebel got the idea of the kindergarten." The influence of Froebel's pedagogy has been claimed by Frank Lloyd Wright, but we also know that Le Corbusier in Switzerland or Carlo Scarpa in Italy have been raised in the Froebel methodology and the gifts on which his teaching is based on. Norman Brosterman published in 1997 Inventing Kindergarten, where he demonstrates the influences of Froebel thesis with modernist movements such as the Bauhaus in Germany or De Stijl in the Netherlands. Gift number 3 to 6 are boxes containing wood blocks. For gift number 3, 8 cubes form a bigger cube where put together. Number 4 contains rectangular wood blocks such as dominoes which form the same cube as box 3. Box 5 introduces the diagonal with triangular pieces. The gifts are from 1826, and the plates you see here are from 1860. More than a century after Froebel's concepts have been widely spread through the US, minimal art, first called ABC art, reinvested simple combinatory forms. I only wanted to focus on this game that was addressed to older, already literate pupils. The text on each face from each cube describes its own position in the entire structure, and the sense of the text explores the structure of language itself, like grammatical principles. I unfortunately can't tell you more about this interaction between language and space because I don't read German, and I haven't found out more about this game yet. But I believe it could be a nice link to the understanding of how Carl André's poetry is embodied in his culture. I learned from Carl André how to sequence images as units on the floor, like in this piece called A Silent Show in a gallery in Vienna in 2008. Or more recently with this piece called Le Tapis, the rug, exhibited at Wills in Brussels, where I just had a show. I recently discovered that Martin Kippenberger also displayed 1,300 images on the floor, which were used as a catwalk in the studio of the fashion designer Claudia Skoda. This was in 1976. I would like to end up with this image as a tribute to my friend Connie Pertil, a Red Sox fan from Boston who designed Diaz Carl André. And I want to thank him for not publishing any flying carpet in this new André Bible. This fresh released pairs of socks promotes Le Musée des Erreurs, the Museum of Mistakes, which is the title of my most recent project. Because we are not allowed anymore to walk on most of Carl André's pieces in museums, I hope museum shops will soon sell the Museums of Mistakes socks to make it possible again. And I discovered in the book this sculpture Carl Andre did with a sock in the 1960s that I didn't know about. So thank you to the whole DIA team for the great job you've done. Thank you all for your attention.